Well, I was looking for the person that was supposed to come up here, but I guess that's supposed to be me. 1, 2. Okay, well, the mice have been playing in our sound system, so we'll have to try to fix that. So it's good to be back. Good to see everyone. The Lord is good. Praise God. We're still here. And so we left off on, well, I guess it was July now. We left off on Jesus going to Pilate. And so tonight we want to continue on that and give you some more background on that. And so we'll give you a little test to see if you remember some things too. But back then, of course, Judea was a very unstable place, kind of like the United States is right now, filled with sedition and insurrections and riots and revolts. And typically, when a Roman governor ruled in the area of Judea at that particular time, they only lasted usually 12 to 36 months. So it wasn't a real long-term job for somebody just because of the pressure that they were under. And of course, if someone would last for just 3 years at that particular time, it was actually quite an achievement. So in fact, not many rulers made it beyond that point. So 3 years was kind of the cutoff for most governors that tried to govern that particular area. But Pontius Pilate was really different because he had ruled for 10 years in Judea, and he had actually obtained a place in history because of that. And the reason that Pontius Pilate was able to last as long as he was he had what we would call a ruthless or a brutal fashion or form of leadership, all right? And so consequently, because he was the way he was, the Jews were avidly looking for a way to get rid of him. They absolutely hated and despised Pontius Pilate. So when the Jews attempted to get rid of Jesus, they had a strategy to get rid of Pilate also. All right, and there were actually 3 parts to their plan, and we'll just give you a little review in case you forgot those, or you don't remember them, or you weren't here when I taught this the first time. But first of all, part 1 was that the religious leaders wanted to see Jesus to be, they wanted to see him judged by the Roman court. And of course, this would ruin his reputation if they could achieve this, and of course, guarantee his crucifixion. So at the same time, it would also vindicate them in the eyes of the people. So in other words, they wouldn't be the bad guys here. It would be those bad Romans and Pontius Pilate, all right? So to make this happen, they officially brought 2 charges against Jesus. And of course, first they said that Jesus had told people not to pay their taxes, number 1, and of course, which wasn't true. And secondly, King of the Jews. So if they could prove these 2 charges, then by Roman law, Jesus was going to have to be executed, all right? That's part 1. Part 2 of their plan was in the process of attempting to dispose of Jesus, the religious leaders wanted to see Pilate plan. And so if Pilate were to let Jesus go free, the news of his refusal to crucify from power. So it would be such an offense that the emperor would either banish or execute Pilate himself, right? And then the third part of their plan was this. It really didn't matter what Pilate did because the Jews intended to kill Jesus anyway, all right? So if Pilate was not going to crucify him, then of course they had the authority to take him back to the Jewish Sanhedrin court and then sentence him to death for claiming to be the Son of God. But that was the very last measure that they wanted to take. And so by their law, this was blasphemy, and of course it was worthy of being stoned. So if Pilate had let Jesus go free, it was the best case scenario for them. Ultimately, Pilate would end up in trouble for treason and be removed, and then they themselves would have done away with Jesus. And it's no wonder Jesus called the religious leaders of that time, he had a name for them, he called them vipers. All right? And so now when Jesus stood before Pilate, of course, remember, Jesus was given 3 opportunities to speak and to declare his innocence, all right? And of course, nevertheless, we know that he remained silent, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, it says that as a sheep before her shears is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. So Jesus didn't intend to, I shouldn't say he didn't defend himself, because he had already knew, I should say, that it was the Father's will for him to die on the cross. So for many reasons, well, for some reason I should say, after hearing and observing Jesus, Pilate could not bring himself to execute him. He just could not do it. So was it something in Jesus' eyes that maybe instilled what we would call a reverential, godly fear? Or, was it his peaceful, humble demeanor? Could have been that. Was it Jesus' appearance after sweating great drops of blood in Gethsemane and enduring two intense rounds of physical abuse by the temple police and religious leaders? The Bible really doesn't tell us, but nevertheless, Pilate found no fault in Jesus, and he began to look for a loophole to set Jesus free. Okay? And he found one. Does anyone remember what that loophole was? Remember Jesus, where he came from? He came from Galilee. So when he heard that he was from Galilee, no doubt he breathed a huge sign of relief. He was relieved. And of course, the fact that was the loophole he needed to get him out of the political problem, or the issue that he was facing, which he found himself. Luke chapter 23, verse 7 says, as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him on to Herod, who just happened to be in Jerusalem at that particular time. Now, one thing is, and we've never talked about this, and maybe we'll teach on this sometime in depth, but the Herod family was very large, all right? And the most well-known number would, of course, been Herod the Great, who was alive at the time when Jesus was born. And of course, we could do a whole study just on Herod the Great and his paranoia, and he executed a number of his wives and sons, and he was always suspicious of someone taking his throne. As a matter of fact, that was the Herod that tried to kill Jesus when he was an infant, because the wise men had said that he was going to be the king of the Jews. So he was paranoid. And of course, by the time that Jesus had reached the end of his ministry, Herod the Great now had been gone for many years, all right? But, however, he had multiple sons, all right? And he liked the name Herod so much that the 3 that he didn't put to death out of fear of conspiracy began to rule in his place after his passing, all right? First of all, there was Herod Archelaus, all right? And Herod Archelaus, he actually ruled one part of Israel. Then, of course, there was Herod Philip, who ruled the northern parts of Israel. And then lastly, Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee and Perea, and that's an area west of the Jordan River. So who did Jesus go to see? Well, he would have went to see Herod Antipas, because Herod Antipas was the ruler of Galilee, and Pilate found out that Jesus was from Galilee. So Herod Antipas now was the Herod Jesus stood before hours prior to his crucifixion. And of course, Herod had jurisdiction over Galilee, so that it's where Pilate sent him. And so history shows us that Antipas himself, Herod Antipas, was what we would call a wicked ruler. All right, and his name itself is interesting. It has two possible origins, I'll tell you. One possible root for the word Antipas is where we get the word pater, and which is the Greek word for father. So if Antipas came from the word pater, it would mean one who is against his father. All right, and that is one who is against rule or authority, or one who is against his heritage. So this actually depicts rebellion and disrespect for authority. All right, and so while Antipas could also be translated into two words. For the two words would be anti and then pas. And the word pas here means all, and the word anti means against. So what does it mean? Against all. All right. And so and it would be one who is against everything and everyone. So it doesn't matter what interpretation of Antipas we take, both origins reveal that Herod Antipas was a person with whom it was hard to get along with. All right, and of course, there was a fellow by the name, who wrote much history of that particular time by the name of Flavius Josephus, and Josephus actually confirmed this particular that, Antipas was actually disrespected. He disrespected others and was against everyone, Josephus writes, and parental authority, political authority, and any type of authority Herod Antipas was against. All right? So essentially, we might say this, he was a wicked, cruel tyrant, and that's what Flavius Josephus writes of him. So when Jesus, the King of the Jews and the Lord of Lords, stands in front of Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas, he was euphoric when this happened, because Luke chapter 23, verse 8 tells us that when Herod saw Jesus come, he was exceedingly glad. All right, so the word saw here actually means this. It means to see, to behold, or we might say to delightfully view. So he is excited. It actually can also be translated as a scrutinizing look, or to look with the intent to examine. All right, so we could translate this part of the verse if we were to paraphrase it. It would go something like this, that when Herod beheld and delightfully viewed Jesus, he took a scrutinizing look at him with the intent to examine him. Okay, so now this paints a very important view of what Herod Antipas felt the moment that Jesus is finally standing in front of him. Okay, he was absolutely delighted, because he didn't just look at Jesus, but he really beheld and examined Jesus and took a scrutinizing view of him. So, and the Bible says he was exceedingly glad to see him. And exceedingly glad actually in the Greek actually describes he was extremely excited to see Jesus, and it pictures the euphoric emotions of someone who is ecstatic about something. So when Herod saw Jesus, you might say, we could say it this way in our language, he was actually jumping up and down with excitement. All right? And so, why was Herod so excited to see Jesus? Well, Luke chapter 23, verse 8 continues, it says, "For he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he had hoped to see some type of miracle done by him." So he's excited to see a miracle, all right? And so the word desirous here actually describes a wish or a desire. However, the construction used here in this phrase intensifies the wish, makes it a very strong wish or a very strong desire. So we had a very strong wish or a very strong desire to see Jesus perform a miracle. Okay? And for a very long time, Herod had desirously looked for an opportunity to meet Jesus face to face. And this verse said that he was actually desirous, it says, of a long season. All right. And so this actually means, in Greek, it means for many years and for many seasons. All right. So why would Herod have such a strong desire to see Jesus in person? Well, Luke chapter 23:8 says, because he had heard many things of Jesus. All right. So now, Jesus was actually a famous name who had been heard in Herod's household for many, many years. All right. This wasn't the first time he heard that name. So first, Antipas had heard of Jesus' supernatural birth, and of course, who do you think he heard that from? Heard it from his dad. Who was his dad? Herod the Great, who tried to kill him. All right. And incidentally, Herod the Great actually built that particular temple where he was taken to in Jerusalem, all right? And so, of course, he had been the king, Herod the Great, when Jesus was born, and his birth was miraculously legendary, and that is, Herod Antipas had heard about Jesus all his life, all right? Secondly, he had heard about the kings who had came from the east, who had journeyed from afar off at the time of Jesus' birth. So royalty had recognized the lordship of Jesus, so they invested their time and treasure to travel to worship him. And of course, that's what Herod had always heard about Jesus, all right? Thirdly, now Herod Antipas had heard that how his father, Herod the Great, had attempted to kill Jesus when he was an infant. And of course, Antipas had been told that Herod killed all the babies in Bethlehem who were under 2 years of age, and few escaped his wrath except one. His name was Jesus, of course, and this was a remarkable truth. So, and fourthly, Antipas had heard that Jesus and his parents had escaped into Egypt. All right, and they had stayed there and waited for the right moment to return to Israel after the death of his father, Herod the Great. So, and then fifthly and lastly, Antipas had heard about the miraculous healing and deliverance ministry about Jesus. Because remember, he was the ruler of Galilee, and if you remember, most of the signs and wonders that Jesus did were where? It was in Galilee. It was around Capernaum. Remember, Capernaum is Galilee, in that area. So his acts were actually Jesus's, legendary throughout all the land of Israel, even when he was alive on the earth. So Herod had heard all these amazing stories all his life, and it went on for years. And his father and others as well had talked about Jesus extensively, yet no immediate family member had actually met Jesus in person until that moment. Remember, even his father, who pursued him, never met Jesus in person, nor did any of his relatives. So Luke chapter 23, verse 8 says that when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have some miracle done by him. So Herod now is hoping that Jesus would perform a miracle. Now, a miracle actually means here, it's actually the Greek word simeon, and it describes a sign, a mark, or a token that verifies or authenticates an alleged report. So he's looking for Jesus to prove who he is in front of his very eyes. All right. And so it's used, this particular word is primarily used in the Gospels to depict miracles and supernatural events. So Herod wanted to see Jesus do something tangible to authenticate what he had heard about him all these years, or all those years, for his entire life. Okay? However, the Bible said that Herod, in Luke chapter 23, verses 9 and 10, said he questioned him in many words, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood by and vehemently accused him. So, when Jesus just stood there and did nothing, the religious leaders began to vehemently accuse him. All right. Now, the word vehemently here actually is the word eutonos, and it means this. It means at a full pitch or at a full volume, strenuously or vigorously. So in other words, they didn't slightly raise their voices. They were screaming at full volume in an uncontrolled manner. So we might say that the priests and scribes were screaming their heads off at Jesus. All kinds of accusations. So when Herod's own cheers turned to jeers, it led to another round of violent assault against Jesus. And we're going to talk about that.